Okay, guys, today we're going to take a note session that's called Post-War Prosperity and Problems. The other day, when we finished out our test on World War One, we figured out one of the main things, the last thing we learned about was that there was only 20 years in between World War One and World War Two, as World War Two starts in 1939. So there's not a lot to talk about. So we're going to do a couple lessons here this week to talk about what happened in between the war. And then we're going to start World War II by the end of the week, all right? So today's lesson is called Post-War Prosperity and Problems. And really we learned that European countries, every one of them that fought in the war, did not prosper from this war. The losses were huge. France was the biggest loser and so on. So there was only one real country in the world that's going to prosper. And you can imagine that it's going to be the United States. All along, it was probably one of our intentions to join the war late. Once we were isolated and once we joined the war later in the war, once the war was over with, then everybody would be coming for us for help. And that's pretty much how it worked out. So the first part of this lesson is about the United States. And it's how the United States is going to prosper after World War One. This is the time period in our world when the United States becomes the world leader. Even to this day, when someone needs help around the world, they come to the United States. Well, our influence in the world is going to be at an all-time high after World War One. And this is a time period in our world when the United States becomes a world leader. Now, our economy has never been better. It was booming. Farmers, people were making all kinds of monies. In fact, the 1920s in the United States is called the Roaring Twenties. Now, we don't pay too much attention to it. We don't spend a lot of time on it because you get a lot of it in American history. But this is a time period where cars were being mass produced. In fact, in 1908, you could buy one of Ford's Model Ts for $850. Now, our economy was so good that a few years later there, as you see in 1926, you could buy the same car for about $310. When have you ever lived or known of a product since you've been born that actually costs less as the years go by? Planes were invented for the first time, not invented, but we're flying and so on. And the first passenger plane was flown in 1930. So people were being connected. They were being connected by the car. People were being connected from city to city. Families were together going in planes by 1930. And telephones were invented. And that's an idea or a look at what one of the first telephones looked like, where communication was open. People were talking to each other. And it was a really fun time to live in the United States. Now, on a social level, and as far as the culture was concerned, sometimes the United States in the 1920s was called the Jazz Age. Now, jazz was the music of the time. And for you dancers in the crowd, the Charleston was the dance of the time. It was a fast-paced life. It was a fast-paced type of music. It was a fast-paced type of dance. This Charleston was, where you were flinging your arms and kicking your feet, and really a fun dance to do, as our dancers in the crowd will tell us. You can see Louis Armstrong there, the face of the Jazz Age, the great American trumpeter. You can see these little clubs that were open called speakeasies, and you can see that girls are starting to let their hair down, so to speak. You can do a little research on what a flapper was, and so on. Now, the 1920s in the United States was marked by some pretty interesting events as well. This was a time period where the American Charles Lindbergh is going to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, which doesn't just connect countries, it connects continents, all right? And that was a huge deal. You can see Charles's picture there in our notes, and you can see his very famous plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. And this was a major event that's going to not just, as I said, connect countries, but it's going to connect continents, which is a game changer as far as air flight is concerned. Now, there are a couple other events that we talk about here during this time period in the 1920s in the United States. Prohibition. The Constitution has been changed, and one of those changes happens in January of 1920. It's called Prohibition, and it's the 18th Amendment of the Constitution. Now, alcohol became a huge problem in the United States. It always had been. Our founding fathers, Samuel Adams, George Washington, they all consumed alcohol. But it got such a problem that people were going to these clubs and they were drinking alcohol and they were hopping in their cars and driving into buildings. And it became a real problem, alcohol was. So our government decided to make it a change to the Constitution, which said people could no longer manufacture, consume, or sell alcohol. Think about how well that would go over these days. But Prohibition was later repealed, but it gives some good stories that you'll learn about in American history about bootlegging and so on, all right? But that's an event that happened in the 20s. Another event that happens in the 20s happens for you girls in the crowd. Now, women, you guys are going to gain your freedom and your right to vote, all right? You don't like the reason why this was, and the reason why you really got a lot of freedoms after the war, and especially the 19th Amendment of the Constitution in August of 1920, your right to vote, girls, was because when the men were away fighting, you were the ones that were taking care of the farms. You were the ones that were taking care of the factories and so on. And you're going to gain a lot of freedoms because of that, and it was great. And that's what's going to happen. Now, those were all the great things that were happening throughout the 20s and so on. But very, very quietly, there were some problems. There were some economic flaws that were very, very quiet that no one could really see. Now, in the 20s, wages began to decrease. Wages began to decrease. Folks were not willing to pay workers as much as they did before. One effect of that is inflation, and we're going to have to go back to the Roman Empire lesson to remember what inflation was. Inflation is when a rise in the prices results in a decrease in the value of money, okay? Which inevitably led for people that were working for businesses to make less money. It was a very quiet little issue, but it's going to add up to something bigger as the 1920s goes along. Now, farmers in the United States were suffering. Farmers were the backbone of our society, just like farmers, and I'll refer to Rome again, was the backbone of Roman society. Now, during World War I, American farmers were loaded with money because the Europeans demanded our grain, and American farmers made a lot of money. Now, what happened was a lot of those farmers took money and borrowed it from the bank and put money into buying more farm machinery to make more product, to make more money. Well, the problem with that was World War I is going to end, and the farmers are left with a bunch of product that really is not in demand and is not needed by the Europeans anymore. They're left with a bunch of farm machinery that they can't use because they're not producing that much, and they're left with a lot of debt. So it caused them to raise their prices, which people couldn't pay, and the overproduction, producing a surplus of crops, really is going to hurt the American farmer after World War I. So debt was huge. People were in debt big time. They were borrowing money, they were investing it, and it was a real big problem. On top of that, Europeans were not paying back their debts. All right, Europeans borrowed a lot of money from American banks during World War I. And after the war, we know that European countries were devastated. So they had no way to pay back that debt, and that was a problem. Now, one thing that we did was try to improve our economy by putting huge tariffs on imported goods. Now, a tariff is a tax, and it's a tax on imported goods, which meant if a European shoemaker wanted to come into the United States and sell shoes, he would first have to pay a tax before he even stepped foot into the United States. And they couldn't afford that. So what happened was Europeans could not sell their stuff in our country, and it led to the Europeans not being able to make money and pay back their debt. Now, these were very, very quiet economic flaws that were happening throughout the 1920s, but it was going to lead up to something bigger. Now, speaking of leading up to something bigger, this is the event that everything's going to come to fruition, and everyone's going to realize what's going on here in the United States. It was a very famous event called the stock market crash. On October 29th, 1929, the stock market is going to crash. And it's a very difficult lesson to teach and understand. If I was in the classroom, I would teach it to you. What I want you guys to do right now is I want you to leave this note session real quick, hit stop or hit pause. I want you to go back into the Show Me section where it says Notes, Prosperity, and Problems, and there's a little video there. There's a little 6-minute video that I want you guys to watch right now. So stop what you're doing, go watch that little video. As soon as you're done watching that video, come back to the note session and I will be continuing along. It's going to give you a real good idea about what the stock market crash was all about. As soon as you come back, go ahead and hit play, and you can continue and finish up the lesson. Go now. Well, one of the major effects of this was that the American economy was at the lowest point of a business cycle. And the economic word for that is depression. A depression is the lowest point of the business cycle. And that's where you get the very, very famous event, the Great Depression. Now, wages are going to decrease tremendously because a lot of people went ahead and invested in the stock market and they lost everything. When you lose everything and all your money that you borrowed from banks, even to put in your life savings, you lose your home, you lose your car. It's a big you lose your business. Wages are going to decrease. There's no business activity. Now, business activity is very simple. It's when money is exchanging hands throughout your community. Now, an example of that was if you're used to going to breakfast on Sunday morning, well, you couldn't afford that anymore. So that business doesn't get the money that they're usually getting on a Sunday morning, which means they're suffering, which means they cannot pay their employees, which means if they go out of business, that employee loses their job. So for that reason, their unemployment rate was at the highest it has ever been, the highest it has ever been in the United States after the Great Depression. Well, there was poverty. People didn't have money. And remember, after World War I, the world was depending on the United States for help. Well, guess what? We couldn't help them. So a major effect of this is that the world economy is going to sink. Now, what did the nations do to us? What were the responses by other nations? Well, other nations, guess what? United States, if you put high tariffs on us, we're going to put high tariffs on you. And that's what they did. So Americans that were trying to sell their stuff in other countries had to pay a tax before they even stepped foot in the country. So basically, turnabout is fair play. Now, the other thing was there was no more loans. We could not borrow money from other countries because they were broke after World War I. So this is an absolute mess, and you guys have read all about this. Now, you can learn all about the Great Depression by just looking at the images. So I gave you a couple of my favorites here. You can see, these guys were doctors. These guys were war veterans from World War I. They were broke. They couldn't get a job. The bottom middle picture, you see a little kid. Why can't you give my dad a job? It was a problem. Now, the middle top picture is an example of what we call a Hooverville. Now, President Herbert Hoover was our president during the Depression. And these people that were homeless went into Central Park and set up little wood shacks all over the United States, for example. Anything they could get their hands on. They made little communities made out of just wood that was lying in alleys and whatever they could get their hands on. And they were called Hoovervilles. Now, the image to the right, top and bottom, are examples of bread lines and soup kitchens that you would go and you would have a donut and a cup of coffee for the unemployed. Some businesses would be able to do that. So you can go through and see millions of images for the Depression. Now, the problem was our president was saying all the right things. Oh, we're going to get back. Prosperity is right around the corner and so on. But the problem with Herbert Hoover was he didn't have a plan. He didn't have a plan. And that's why he's going to lose the election to a guy named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which you guys know, FDR, for what he did in bringing the United States through World War II. Well, guess what? Many of you didn't know that he inherited this mess, which we called the United States during the Great Depression. Well, the difference between Roosevelt and Hoover is Roosevelt had a plan, and his plan was called the New Deal. The New Deal of 1933 was signed, and what he did was the government granted money to each state. So you're asking, well, why can't you just give people money? Well, the reason why you can't just give people money directly is because you'll run out of goods, and inflation will appear, and it'll be a big problem. So he gave money to the states, and it was the states' job to figure out how to put money back in the economy. Well, one way to put money back into people's pockets is to create jobs. And what they did was each state relied on their cities to create public works jobs. If you know anybody that works for the city of Fort Lauderdale that takes care of stop signs or potholes, or even a little park ranger that always cuts the grass at the park right next to Gibbons outside my classroom, that's a public works job. He works for the city. And those were created during the Great Depression, during FDR's New Deal. Now, another thing he did was he created the Social Security Act of 1935, which allowed for old people not to have to work into their 80s and 90s. They got to a certain age, around 65 and so on, and they could retire. So they would take money out of their paychecks, put it in a big fund, and then when they retired, they would get a certain amount of money during each month per check. It wouldn't be as much as they would normally make, but it was enough for them to be socially secure. So the Social Security Act of 1935 helped with unemployment, helped with minimum wage, unions. It allowed for people to only work a 40-hour work week and so on, all right? And that helped senior citizens and that helped the unemployed to try to get us back on our feet and get us out of the Great Depression. Now, one thing that he did was he bailed out the farmers, all right? So earlier in the lesson, I told you that the farmers were left with a bunch of surplus crops. Well, the government bought those crops from the farmers and divvied them out to the states, and the states would take them to the bread banks and the food banks and so on, and divvy out that money so people could eat. Now, individual states did different things with the money that they were granted. Now, Tennessee, and if you've ever been to Tennessee or whitewater rafting on the Ocoee River, the great state of Tennessee created the TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, they had to be creative and try to find out ways how people could save money. So one thing that they did was they took the rivers around Tennessee and they built dams, which provided for cheaper electricity. If people didn't have to pay that much money for electricity, they could take that money and they could spend it around town, which would improve the business activity around town. It prevented floods, which helped the farmers because floods would devastate crops and so on, and it provided for better navigation. Rivers were widened and so on. People literally were taking a boat to work, which meant they didn't need a car anymore, which means they didn't have a car payment anymore, which means that money they were saving, they might be able to go to Sunday morning breakfast and so on. And Tennessee did a great job with these rivers. Now, I have been fortunate enough to be on the Ocoee River, and I've been whitewater rafting on that river a lot. In fact, those are pictures of the Ocoee River and the whitewater rafting that you do on the Ocoee River. You can see an example of a dam there. I remember the picture to the left. I remember going right through there on the Ocoee River, and I remember looking up into the mountain, and you see signs all over the place: TVA, 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 for the Tennessee Valley Authority that was created as a result of the Great Depression and as a result of President Roosevelt's New Deal. Now, one thing that President Roosevelt said, you know what, Europe? We saved you in World War I. We went over there, France and Great Britain, and we saved your behinds. And now you don't want to stand by us and help us when we're struggling. So you know what? This is what we're going to do. We're going to form better relationships with countries that are here in the Western Hemisphere. And he called them good neighbor policies. We're going to be good neighbors. We're going to help out our own over here in this hemisphere in the world, which is going to focus on Central American and South American countries. In fact, you can go and you can see images like I have provided for you of FDR meeting with the Brazilian president, trying to create this good neighbor relationship. You can see him with images of a Nicaraguan dictator. You can see him with the Cuban president Batista before Castro took over. And it included communism. In fact, you don't have to write this, but he had a very famous phrase. It said, in the field of world policy, I would dedicate this nation, the United States, to the policy of being a good neighbor. Now, the last question that we have to answer today is, when did the Great Depression end? So if you guys had a pulse today listening to any of this information, you probably would have thought like, oh man, how are we ever going to get out of this Great Depression? It sounds horrible. How will we ever get out of the Great Depression? Well, how do we do it? Think about an answer to that question for a second. I might start to give you some hints. When did the Great Depression end? Well, I think the images probably gave it away. It's when the United States, there's the graphics for you, started to get ready for World War II. It's when we started to mobilize for World War II. It's when the federal government gave money to factories to build planes for World War II, to build tanks. That employed hundreds of thousands of Americans, put money back into their pockets. And this is a very important question that you guys have to answer. It's, when did the Great Depression end? Always remember in your future lessons for the next few years in school, the Great Depression ends in the United States when we start to mobilize for World War II.